A group of racist thugs stormed Khalil's home, forcing him into making a split-second decision that could ignite a deadly battle. But just minutes later, a daring move by Khalil would set off a chain of events beyond his control, turning this confrontation into more than just a personal fight. It would become a battle that could determine the fate of an entire community. Subscribe now and let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. Khalil stood on the porch, his eyes locked on the darkness that was slowly swallowing the houses down the street. The cold wind brushed past him, sending a chill through his bones. But it wasn't the cold that made him shiver. It was the unsettling feeling rising inside him as he heard the hurried footsteps echoing along the empty road. A group of men, their faces hardened with scorn, brought with them an air of menace as they stepped into his yard. They didn't need to say a word. They just began to destroy everything in sight, shattering windows, smearing dirty paint across the walls. "Get over here, Khalil!" one of them yelled, his mocking laughter mingled with cruelty. They believed they were asserting their dominance, and Khalil, a black man, was their target. Not just him, but all people like him, those they saw as outsiders, enemies to their so-called order. They wanted to see him afraid, to make sure he understood that this was their territory, not the land of someone like him. But Khalil didn't back down. More than ever, the fire of determination burned inside him. This wasn't the first time he'd faced fear, and he knew this time he wouldn't let himself be defeated. Khalil turned his gaze back to the house, the invasion clear in every shattered window, every smear of paint. Memories wiped away, but not the pain he felt inside. The gang slowly advanced, the invasion too obvious to ignore. One of them sneered, a baseball bat dangling loosely in his hand, his face full of arrogance. "I heard you're a good soldier, but here, you're just a black man," he spat, his voice dripping with contempt. Khalil didn't respond. He didn't need to. Every step of the gang echoed with threats, but in Khalil's eyes there was something cold and resolute. He wasn't just a man defending his home. He was the representative of a community oppressed for so long, the voice of pain and silence buried deep. That feeling didn't come from weapons or military training. It came from being a man who had witnessed too much injustice, who had lived under the shadow of racism his entire life. Memories of his mother, of neighbors silently enduring oppression. Those moments fueled the fire within him. He couldn't back down, not now. Khalil stepped out the door, his eyes locked with theirs, unflinching. "Leave," he said, his voice deep and cold as steel. His words weren't just a command, they were a warning. The gang halted, surprised by Khalil's calmness, but then their leader stepped forward, his gaze sharp. "You think you can do something?" he asked, his voice full of challenge. Khalil didn't answer, he just stared into his eyes, ready for whatever came next. Silence blanketed the neighborhood, broken only by the footsteps of the attackers, their pace blending with the wind's sigh. Khalil stood firm, unmoving, his gaze as cold as stone, locked on the leader of the gang, a tall man still gripping his baseball bat. Khalil knew what he had to do. This wasn't just a personal confrontation. This was a fight for respect, for his right to live and for the community he belonged to. "Get out of here," Khalil said, his voice calm but filled with power and resolve. He stared directly into the eyes of the leader, showing no fear. "This is not your land. This is my home, and I will not run." The gang froze, stunned by Khalil's composure. But only a moment later the leader burst into a mocking laugh, dripping with contempt. "You think you can do something, black man?" he jeered, stepping closer, ready to raise the bat. Khalil didn't need a second to think. With a lightning-quick motion, he grabbed the man's arm and slammed him to the ground in a swift, decisive move. Without pausing, Khalil turned to face the others, each step he took like a declaration of war. One of the men lunged at him, wielding a metal shovel like a weapon. Khalil easily dodged the attack, using his training to bring the man down, grabbing his wrist and slamming him hard against the wall. The strike was powerful, yet controlled. No unnecessary movement. "Leave," Khalil repeated. his voice steady as steel, leaving no room for doubt. He wasn't just protecting his home, he was standing up for a community that had been oppressed and forgotten. This was a fight for justice, for the respect he and his people deserved. The gang began to waver. Looking into Khalil's determined eyes, they realized they couldn't win easily. Their retreat was slow, each step filled with hesitation, fear creeping into their minds. Khalil remained still, silent yet resolute, waiting for a final rejection. "Leave," he said again. This warning wasn't just a threat, it was the declaration of a man who had made up his mind not to let anyone control his life any longer. Khalil stood alone on the porch, his eyes fixed on the darkness. He didn't feel victory, only a quiet before the storm. The gang had backed off, but Khalil knew it was only temporary. The threat had never truly ended. These men didn't just want to defeat him, they wanted to prove their power was unchallenged. They would come back. He heard the distant roar of a car engine, the sound echoing through the late-night silence, signaling their return. Every time he heard that noise, it felt like a warning bell in his mind. He knew he couldn't keep living in fear, and he couldn't run. The footsteps of these thugs weren't just a threat to him. They were a manifestation of the racist system that had oppressed people in this community for so long. Khalil clenched his fists, a surge of heat rising within him. He thought of his mother's words, the stories of generations that had suffered in silence, the pain his family had borne without a sound. They couldn't keep enduring. "It's not just about me," Khalil told himself. "This is a fight for all of us." The gang weren't just troublemakers, they were representatives of an oppression that had existed for years. They were the enemy of not just Khalil, but of the entire community striving for justice. Today he wouldn't back down. He turned back into the house, grabbed his self-defense gun and looked out the window. Just one more day and they would come. Khalil knew this battle wasn't going to be just a personal fight. It was a fight for justice, for the right to live that the oppressed deserved, and Khalil would never allow himself to be defeated. The streetlights cast their glow onto the weathered wall of the house where Khalil stood, his eyes distant, as if the thoughts in his mind held him captive. The distant noise from the neighborhood only weighed heavier on his heart. Today, everything had become clearer than ever before. This battle wasn't just his personal fight, it was the fight of an entire community, one that had endured rejection and discrimination for far too long. Khalil turned and saw Amira, his younger sister, standing in the doorway. She had always been there to witness his struggles. The long nights when he wrestled with painful memories, the days when he felt abandoned in his own country. Amira wasn't like the others. She was the only one who truly understood him, the one who had stood by him during his darkest moments. Amira looked at Khalil, her eyes seeming to read right through him. "You're still thinking about what happened, aren't you?" she asked, her voice soft but filled with resolve. Khalil nodded, his shoulders heavy as if the weight of the world was pressing down on him. "It's all too much, Amira. I don't know what to do next. I'm just one person, one man in this world. And they're too powerful, too many." Amira stepped closer, placing her hand on his shoulder, her touch warm. "You're not just one person, Khalil," she said, her voice calm but firm. "You're someone who has the power to change everything. You're not just fighting for yourself, you're fighting for all the people who don't have a voice, people like us." Khalil looked up at Amira. Her words were like a light in the darkness, but he still couldn't shake the feeling of helplessness. "We're just nobodies. Everything always goes the way of the powerful, and we can never win." Amira shook her head, her gaze unwavering. "Khalil, don't you see? Every day you live is a change. You're not just one man fighting alone. You're the spark that others will follow. You've already done so much, and it's not a failure to stand up again. We can change everything if you don't back down." Amira held his gaze, not once looking away, despite the exhaustion and pain etched on his face. She knew that Khalil hadn't yet recognized the strength within him, which was why he felt lost, hesitant. But she also knew, more than anyone, that he was the only one who could make a difference. "We can't change this society by staying silent," Amira continued, her voice slow but steady. "We can't just sit back and let racism destroy all the human values left in this world. You're the one who can do it, Khalil. And we're not just doing this for ourselves, but for the children, for the people who never had the chance to stand up and fight." Khalil looked at his sister, feeling the strength in every word she spoke. Amira was right. Over the years, he'd endured the hostility, but he'd never truly realized he could be the one to stand against it. He had thought his battles were just to protect his home, to preserve a little bit of freedom, but now he understood he couldn't do it alone. This fight was for everyone who had been oppressed, everyone whom society had denied their right to live, to be respected. Khalil sighed, but a different feeling, a stronger one, began to rise within him. It was the feeling of someone who wouldn't stand by and accept injustice any longer. He might not win every battle, but he would never give up. He would fight. Not just for himself, but for those who didn't have a voice, for those who had no rights. "What do we do next?" Khalil asked, his voice now full of determination. He was no longer the man he had been, one filled with fear and isolation. He was a warrior, a man standing up not only for himself, but for everyone he loved and respected. Amira smiled, a gentle yet powerful smile. "We'll gather everyone, Khalil. We won't let them continue to oppress and humiliate us. We'll bring the truth to light and nothing will stop us. Remember, when one person stands up, others will follow." Khalil nodded. The resolve and determination within him ignited. This wasn't the time to be afraid. This was the time to fight, to take back what they had stolen, and he would never back down. Khalil sat alone in the dimly lit room, the only light coming from an old desk lamp. Maps were spread out before him, each detail, every street, every hidden corner thoroughly examined. Outside, the night had settled in, and he could feel the tension building within him. This fight wasn't just against a group of thugs he'd faced before. What he was up against was a vast criminal network protected by powerful organizations, where people like him were mere cogs in a much larger machine. He couldn't do it alone, and now he knew he needed to connect with his old comrades, those who had fought alongside him through thick and thin. Khalil quickly dialed a familiar number, and it didn't take long for the voice on the other end to pick up. "Rami, Omar." Khalil's voice was steady. "This isn't just about the thugs anymore. We're up against the whole system behind them. It's a criminal network that's bigger than we thought, protected by those in power. You know what needs to be done, right?" There was a moment of silence on the other end before Rami spoke, his voice low and full of concern. "You're not kidding, Khalil. What you're talking about is no joke. This network runs deep, but if you've made up your mind, we're with you." Omar's voice came through next, full of resolve. "I'm in. We can't let them run rampant anymore. No matter the danger, we'll take care of this." Khalil smiled faintly. It warmed his heart to hear the support of his comrades, people he knew would never back down in the face of overwhelming odds. They had fought together in the past, and now they would fight again to take down the injustice that had spread far and wide. "What's next?" Rami asked, his voice preparing for a long, hard battle. Khalil took a deep breath, closing his eyes for a moment to visualize the next steps. "First, we need intel. These thugs aren't acting alone. They have protection from higher powers. We need to find out who's behind them, who's supplying them with money and weapons." Omar spoke up. "So where do we start? We need to track the supply routes and find the connections between them and the bigger organizations." "Exactly," Khalil responded. "We need to approach the people in this network without giving ourselves away. I'll start by digging into some of the members of the group, those who might know about their suppliers. Then we'll plan a surprise strike on their stronghold." Rami and Omar agreed to the plan, and they began discussing the finer details of what would come next. They all understood this wasn't going to be a simple confrontation. These criminals had numbers, and they had hidden support from forces in the shadows, forces that wouldn't be easily beaten. The next day, Khalil and Omar decided to track one of the individuals they suspected of being linked to the gang. They moved carefully through the city's darker neighborhoods, places where criminals frequently gathered. Khalil felt the tension in the air, every step needing to be cautious, every movement deliberate to avoid detection. Meanwhile, Rami began gathering information from outside sources. He reached out to people who might have valuable intel, from former police officers to political figures who might know about the underground connections. Rami wasn't just covering the obvious sources. He also approached a few members of the community who had witnessed or heard about the shady dealings involving the gang. He needed to extract the kinds of details people were too afraid to talk about. After several days of surveillance and information gathering, the three friends met at a safe location. Khalil and Omar had gathered crucial information. One of the gang's leaders had connections to several powerful politicians, and they were planning to launch a large-scale weapons trafficking operation. Their network didn't just extend through the city. It had international ties, and it was dangerous. "We need to move fast," Khalil said, his voice cold and certain. "We're going to have to cut off their supply chains and then hit them where it hurts." Rami nodded, determination in his eyes. "We won't let them spread fear any longer, but this time we'll hit them harder. It's not just about taking down the thugs, it's about dismantling the entire system." Khalil stood up, looking at the maps and documents they had gathered. "This is the time for us to act. We can't just rely on intel from one side. We'll have to approach the financial backers behind this. Let them know we're not the ones to be easily defeated." The war didn't stop there. What they had uncovered was a complex criminal network, shielded by powerful underground forces. But Khalil knew that if they didn't act immediately, both he and his community would continue to be crushed under the manipulation of these powerful players. They weren't just fighting for justice. They were fighting for a future where everyone could live freely and equally. The three friends went over their plans, steeling themselves for an unrelenting battle. The criminals wouldn't let up easily, but Khalil knew that if they didn't rise up now, silence would be the thing that made everything pointless. This was the moment to confront the enemy head-on and change the game. That night, the city was swallowed by a dense, thick darkness, with only the faint yellow glow of streetlights casting weak light across the empty alleys. Khalil and his team moved swiftly through the shadows, their footsteps soft on the cold stone pavement. Each of them gripped their weapons tightly, eyes sharp and minds focused, ready for any unexpected danger. The plan had been carefully laid out, but Khalil knew that in a battle like this, nothing could be predicted. The thugs were still hunting them, and every decision, no matter how small, could mean the difference between life and death. The air was thick with tension, but Khalil kept his calm. He glanced over at Rami and Omar, the men who had stood by him through all these years. "We have to go through this alley," Khalil whispered, pointing toward a dark passageway. "They won't expect us to pass through here, but be careful, this place isn't safe." Omar nodded, his eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. "Be careful, they might already know we're close." Khalil knew they couldn't stop. They were heading for the gang's hideout, where a major weapons deal was going down. But the road ahead wouldn't be easy. As they moved, a faint noise came from behind them. A figure sprinted toward them at high speed. Khalil immediately signaled for the team to stop, quickly finding a spot to hide in the darkness. "We've got company," Khalil whispered, peeking through a crack in the window of an abandoned house. A group of thugs emerged from the shadows, moving in a tight formation, their eyes searching for anything out of place. Khalil and his team held their breath, not daring to move. They couldn't afford to leave any trace, couldn't let them discover their presence. These thugs had backing from powerful forces, and if they were discovered, it wouldn't just be them at risk. It would mean disaster for the whole community. Each second felt like an eternity. Khalil could feel the weight of the tension in the air, every breath he took a potential giveaway. Finally, the thugs moved on, but the silence lasted only a moment. "We need to move faster," Khalil muttered, signaling for the team to continue. But as soon as they started to move, a gunshot rang out from a distance. A thug had snuck from the shadows and aimed at Khalil's team. There was no time to react. The shot fired, the bullet zipping past Khalil's ear. The stillness shattered completely. "Run!" Khalil shouted. Chaos erupted. Omar charged forward, returning fire at the attacker. Rami, with the calm and skill honed through years of experience, quickly implemented a strategy to surround and take down the thugs advancing toward them. Khalil, weapon in hand, had his mind working at full speed. Every decision made in a split second could determine their fate. The three of them swiftly dove into a narrow alley, a place where the thugs couldn't easily follow. But before long, a heavily armed squad from the criminal gang began spreading throughout the street. Khalil realized they'd walked right into a trap. This was no longer a simple confrontation. Now they were facing a much larger force, well equipped with weapons and backed by those hidden in the shadows. "We need to take them out before they call for reinforcements," Khalil barked. Rami and Omar knew exactly what had to be done. They split up, each taking a different direction. Bullets whizzed past them as they fought back. Despite the fatigue and mounting pressure, Khalil didn't hesitate. He used every combat skill he had to take down the thugs charging toward him. Khalil wasn't fighting just for himself. He was fighting for everyone in his community, those who couldn't stand up against the violence and racism. Every punch, every dodge became part of a bigger battle, one that he and his team had to win. "We can't stop now," Khalil gasped, glancing at Rami and Omar. "We're almost there. We have to finish this to protect the community." Rami and Omar exchanged looks, knowing they had gone too far into this fight to back down now. They nodded, and alongside Khalil they pressed forward, one step at a time, undeterred by the challenges ahead. Khalil stood at the starting point, his gaze fixed on the darkness ahead. The air in the area felt suffocating, thick with tension. Every passing second could be the difference between life and death. Under the dim light of the street lamps, his three friends, Rami and Omar, stood ready, prepared for the battle they knew would have no turning back. This attack wasn't just a fight for their survival. It was a fight for something much bigger. Justice and freedom for the community they were determined to protect. "We're not just fighting for ourselves," Khalil said, his voice deep and resolute. "Every punch, every step we take today is for all those who've suffered, for those who can't stand up. Today we will win, because there is no other way." Rami and Omar nodded. They understood the mission. This wasn't just about taking down a gang, it was about eradicating the underground forces that had long oppressed and destroyed their community. These people hadn't just invaded their lives, they had spread hatred and oppression across the entire society. Khalil spoke again, his tone grave. "We split into 3 teams. I'll lead one. Rami and Omar, you handle the rest. We have to trap them and make sure no one escapes." Once more, the team silently moved into the darkness. They moved quickly and precisely, each person following the predetermined route. The sound of their footsteps was like the whisper of the wind, blending into the night. They had pinpointed the location of the thugs, where they were preparing for a large-scale weapons deal. This was an opportunity they couldn't afford to miss, an opportunity to end the days of living in fear and injustice. As they neared the target, a gunshot rang out. The thugs had spotted them. Without needing a signal, everyone understood that hesitation was no longer an option. The battle began immediately. Khalil and his team charged into the fray like warriors unafraid of death. Every strike was powerful and precise, as if they were fighting not just for their own lives, but for every person in their community. Rami, with his calm demeanor, took down 2 thugs trying to fight back with swift, forceful blows. Omar, equally formidable, used his strength to push back attackers coming from both sides. Khalil didn't hold back. He plunged into the group of thugs, utilizing military techniques honed through years of training. He took down each thug with cold precision. Every punch, every kick wasn't just about self-defense. It was a powerful message to the criminals. This is the end. You no longer have the power to oppress us. The thugs began to realize the danger. Their resistance weakened as they saw Khalil's team was too strong and too determined. But even so, they didn't surrender easily. They called for reinforcements. hidden gunmen in other corners of the area. The fight intensified, but Khalil refused to let his team retreat. Every time he faced an attacker, he thought of the families who had lived in fear, of the neighbors who had silently endured. He couldn't let apathy continue to reign. He had to fight. As the thugs finally started to retreat, Khalil realized that the battle wasn't over. This was just one part of the assault. The bigger goal was still ahead, exposing the truth, destroying their funding, and taking down the organizations behind them. But when he looked at the spoils of the assault, Khalil knew they had done something crucial. They hadn't just defeated a group of criminals. They had won the battle for a free community, for values that had been stolen for so long. Khalil turned to look at Rami and Omar, their eyes filled with determination and pride. We fought not just for ourselves, but for all those who are oppressed. Today is the day we take back our right to live. The battle had ended, but the tension still clung to Khalil and his team. In the darkness of the abandoned building where they had just wiped out the gang, they stood in silence, breathing heavily. Blood still stained their weapons, and the sounds of the defeated criminals echoed around them, but their work wasn't over. This was only the beginning. Khalil carefully surveyed the area as Rami and Omar began collecting crucial documents. Inside a small room, amidst the chaos of discarded belongings, they found a table cluttered with papers and maps. These weren't just scraps of paper, they were evidence of a complex criminal network that had been corrupting and undermining the system. The maps, ledgers, and contracts they sifted through each held a key to exposing the larger criminal organizations and the people behind them. Rami flipped through the papers, his eyes quickly landing on a few documents with names he recognized immediately. "Khalil, you need to see this," Rami called out, pointing to a contract. Khalil moved closer, his gaze fixed on each word. The names of powerful politicians, people the community had once admired, appeared in shady contracts, alongside large sums of money being funneled through various forms. "These are undeniable proofs," Khalil said, his voice low and tense. "We can use these documents to expose the people who've been complicit with them, the ones hiding in the shadows. These are the kinds of pieces that can change everything." Omar, standing across the room, held up a thick notebook. "It's not just these contracts, Khalil. These ledgers also show the flow of money, how they operate, and even links to international criminal organizations. This is irrefutable evidence." Khalil stood still, reflecting on everything they'd been through. For so many years, his community had lived in the dark, unable to speak out, unable to stand up against the underground forces the criminals had used to their advantage. People like him, like Rami, like Omar, had suffered injustice for far too long, but today they had done what many thought was impossible. "These documents will be our weapon," Khalil said, his gaze fixed on the contracts and papers brimming with implication. "We'll bring them to light and confront the criminal system that's been controlling our community. It's time for change." Rami and Omar agreed, knowing that those behind this gang wouldn't give up easily. They weren't just facing street thugs, they were up against a network of hidden power that would do anything to protect its interests. With the documents in hand, they knew they had taken an important step. They hadn't just pushed back the gang, they had to confront the dark forces that had protected them in the shadows. But Khalil knew they couldn't do it alone. They needed help from within the community and from those who could help them expose the truth, those who would stand up against injustice, no matter the consequences. Khalil turned to look at his two companions. "We're not stopping. This is all of our fight, and we're not letting them get away." With these pieces of evidence, Khalil and his team had started a bigger war. A war not just to defeat criminals, but to change the corrupt system that had manipulated their community. They were no longer just fighting for their own survival, but for the values of freedom, justice, and equality, so that everyone like them could live in a world free from oppression. The police arrived hours later, just as the first light of dawn began to filter through the thick trees and aging rooftops of the city. Khalil and his team had retreated to a safe house where they remained in the shadows, preparing for the next step in their plan. They had gathered enough evidence to prove the gang's ties to larger criminal organizations, and they knew the only thing left to do was bring this evidence into the light. But none of them could predict what would happen next. As they were sorting through their documents and planning their next moves, the sound of police sirens echoed in the distance. Patrol cars appeared along the darkened streets, their red and blue lights flashing, creating an atmosphere that was both tense and unsettling. It wasn't fear of being caught that made them uneasy, but the intervention of the police that made Khalil and his team nervous. This wasn't the first time they had faced suspicion from law enforcement. They knew that not all police officers were impartial in the fight against crime, and there could be elements within the force working for the very people behind the criminal gang. At that moment, Captain Harrison's police car pulled up in front of the house where Khalil and his team were hiding. Harrison was a respected captain, known for his fairness and unwavering commitment to rooting out corruption within the police force. He was the only officer Khalil trusted. Harrison had known about the gang's activities for a long time, but he had never had enough evidence to take action. "We've arrived just in time," Harrison said as he stepped out of the car, his voice calm but firm. "We've received reports about the attack and everything you've done. Thank you for stopping them from continuing their reign of terror." Khalil studied Harrison, his eyes showing both suspicion and hope. "Are you sure none of your officers are working for them?" Khalil asked seriously. Harrison stared at him, understanding the concern. "I understand your doubts, but trust me, I won't let corrupt elements influence justice. I'll lead my team to arrest all the members of this gang and confiscate every weapon they have. Justice will be served." Khalil wasn't entirely at ease. He knew that in a corrupt system, justice didn't always prevail over the forces in the shadows. But for now, he could trust Harrison, a man who had proven his integrity and determination in the fight for fairness. The police began deploying their teams, infiltrating the areas where the gang had been hiding. Police cars surrounded the neighborhood, and one by one, gang members were taken into custody. Weapons, drugs, and crucial documents related to the gang's operations were seized. Part of this operation was aimed at weakening the criminal network, making it harder for them to continue operating. Still, Khalil couldn't shake the unease. The evidence he and his team had collected didn't just point to the gang. It could also expose the connections between them and powerful individuals within the government. Khalil felt that true justice hadn't yet been served. His team knew that the battle wasn't over. They would have to keep fighting, not just the criminals, but the very system that had been protecting them. "Commande." As Harrison approached Khalil, he looked him squarely in the eye and said, "This is just the beginning. We won't stop here. I'll keep investigating and uncover every hidden connection." Khalil looked back at the captain with resolve. "We won't stop. This is just the start." Harrison nodded. "Justice will prevail, and I'll be here to help you." With the police intervention, the criminal gang was defeated, but Khalil and his team knew the real fight had only just begun. They had taken down the tip of a much larger criminal network, but the greater issue still loomed ahead. Confronting a system that was hiding corrupt elements, those in power who could easily derail justice. But Khalil was ready, because he knew that once the truth was exposed, nothing could stop the fight for justice. The world around them had begun to calm after the long, tense days. The criminal gang Khalil and his team had targeted had been defeated. The leaders were in custody, key documents had been made public, and the politicians involved were brought into the light. The police had done their part and began a deeper investigation, seizing weapons and documents tied to the illegal activities. The community where Khalil lived finally began to feel the winds of hope. Khalil stood on the balcony of the house, gazing out at the streets where the first rays of sunlight were breaking through the once darkened city. A strange sense of relief washed over him. The battles of the past had brought results, and they had defeated the enemy. But in his heart, a thought lingered. This victory was just the first step of a longer, harder journey ahead. "We did it," Rami said, stepping up beside Khalil, his eyes also watching the scene outside. "The leaders can't escape, and things are changing, but I feel like we've opened a door, but it's not the end, is it?" Khalil turned to face Rami, a slight smile playing on his lips. "That's right. This isn't the end. It's just one step, a big step, but it's still only the beginning. We've defeated this gang, but for a truly just society, there are many challenges still ahead. Umar walked over, nodding in agreement. The street thugs are gone, but the hidden forces are still out there. The ones funding them, the ones behind this entire corrupt system, they're not dealt with yet. We can't let our guard down. Khalil looked into the eyes of his two friends, the determination in his gaze unchanged. We've changed part of this system, but it's not enough. The system we live in isn't just made up of street criminals, it's a vast network with powerful people behind it. We've only faced a small piece of the bigger picture, and our work isn't finished. Khalil's words were not only a recognition of reality, but also a reminder of the road ahead. He knew that society needed to change at its roots, not just by taking down criminals, but by confronting the underground structures that protected them. To build a just society, they would have to tackle corruption within the government, the powerful individuals manipulating the system to preserve their own illicit interests. We can't just stand still, Khalil continued. Things are changing, but if we don't keep fighting, the change will only scratch the surface. We need to push forward. We need to fight not just against the criminals, but against the systems that protect them. Rami and Omar nodded. They knew they couldn't stop now, couldn't let all their hard work go to waste. It was time to take on a bigger fight, with challenges they couldn't yet predict, and no matter how tough the battle would be, they would never back down. "What's our next move?" Omar asked, his eyes alight with new conviction. "We keep exposing the truth," Khalil replied, his voice resolute. "And not just for us, but for everyone who can't speak for themselves. We need to create a wave of change that no one can extinguish, so no one else has to suffer under this injustice again." The three of them locked eyes, feeling the strength of their shared determination. Yes, this was a big step, but it was the necessary step to build a more just future for their community. Khalil knew that no matter how long the fight would last, he and his companions would never back down. Because this fight wasn't just for them, it was for everyone who couldn't fight for themselves. And they would keep fighting for a better, fair world. Hit the subscribe button and don't forget to leave a comment so I can hear your thoughts and suggestions for future videos.